Now that we've talked about the big picture of metabolic systems, movement, and the mental side of the game, I want to finish up this module by talking about how training makes you more fit and better condition, because it's important to understand what your body is going through as you progress through metamorphosis or really any type of training. So to do that, let's first talk about this concept of homeostasis, because homeostasis is really the key to our survival. And the easiest way to understand homeostasis is it's the body's drive, this internal drive to maintain its internal environment within the ranges that it needs to in order to survive. So that means things like your hydration, your blood pH, your body temperature, your blood pressure. All of these things are being constantly regulated internally so that you can stay alive. And a big reason they have to be kept in narrow ranges is because metabolism requires that. So if your body temperature gets too high or too low, it impacts your energy production capabilities. If you get dehydrated, if you are low on blood sugar, all of these things impact the body's ability to internally regulate energy production and keep you alive. So this is a really important concept, again, because as we train, we are putting our body under stress. And a stress is really anything, again, that challenges that homeostasis. And that's a good thing. We need stress. Stress has a powerful thing that causes our body to adapt. It's just making sure that we are putting our body under the right type and the right amount of stress that becomes the most important thing. So if we look at how this happens when we train, it's a really interesting story here. So the first thing is we activate the stress response. And the stress response is basically just producing more energy and challenging that homeostasis in the process. Now, as a part of that, we train, we put our body under mechanical and metabolic load, and there are sensors basically in the body that measure that. So just like your car has an array of sensors that are measuring what's happening in the engine and how it's performing, our body has those built in as well. And those sensors are ultimately sending information into our system that causes specific genes to get turned on or turned off. And those genes code for different proteins, and those proteins lead to different physiological changes within our bodies that impact our fitness. So this 4-step process is what's happening no matter what type of training that you're doing. Every type of training is a form of stress. It's just going to trigger different sensors in the body, which leads to different genes being either turned on or turned off, and thus different changes happening. But this essentially is this process of stress recovery and adaptation. So we have the stress when we train that sets off these sensors and causes these genes to be adjusted or to be essentially up or down regulated. And then we have the recovery process where the body takes those proteins and turns them into new structures or better structures in our body. So new muscle fibers, which is possibly they didn't think it used to be, or just bigger muscle fibers that we already have. And all these other tissues that make up different areas of our body's movement and capabilities get bigger, stronger, faster, more efficient, resilient, all these things simply as a result of this process happening over and over again. Now, a big piece too is understanding what drives that from the energy standpoint. And this is where we have to take a minute to talk about the autonomic nervous system because it plays such a key role, and it's something we'll talk about in the next section of the course as well. Now, you've got 2 branches of the autonomic nervous system. You've probably heard of them, but I'll give you a quick review here. The first is the sympathetic nervous system. This is the body's fight or flight nervous system. So anytime that homeostasis is challenged by producing more energy because of a stressor, our sympathetic nervous system is there to meet the job. So increases heart rate, raises our blood pressure, dilates our blood flow, diverts our blood flow into the working muscles and dilates our blood vessels. All these sorts of things to help us meet the demand. So this system, it's called the fight or flight system for a reason, because in times of fight or flight, what do we need? Well, we need a lot more energy. We need it right now. And so that system is designed for that. Now, the other side of the equation is the parasympathetic system. It's the rest and recover or rest and digest system. And ultimately, that job is doing the opposite in some respects. It's slowing your heart rate down. It is decreasing your blood pressure, dilating your blood vessels. So the other one's constricts blood vessels, I should have said. It stimulates digestion, increases appetite, and does all these things basically to put the energy back that you burned during the stress period. And it's basically working together with the sympathetic system. These two systems are just 2 halves of a whole. They work together synergistically, even though they have different functions. Now, we have to understand how this plays out after a workout, because obviously when we work out, we're in a very sympathetic state. We're producing lots of energy. So the first thing that has to happen after a workout is we need that sympathetic system to turn down, right? We need basically the stress response to turn off because the workout's over. We don't need it. So we need our heart rate to come down, our blood pressure, our adrenaline, all these hormones need to come back down more towards baseline levels after we work out. At the same time, we want that parasympathetic system to turn on more effectively and stronger because this is what's going to drive basically digestion, restoring muscle glycogen, the anabolic activity that's going to build essentially the tissues that these genes are turning on. All these things have to happen as a result of that parasympathetic nervous system turning on and allowing our body to divert energy towards recovery. So we can see this process of recovery, repair, and fitness being improved over time through this process of the sympathetic system being activated when we train and we're under stress, and then the parasympathetic system doing its job of rebuilding, remodeling, and repairing and driving the fitness adaptations that were ultimately stimulated by the workout. And this process is just called the stress recovery cycle. And the main variables here are going to be the volume and intensity, right? So we can have a little bit of volume intensity, a moderate amount of volume intensity, and a higher amount of volume intensity. And those variables are just going to drive the amount of stress that our body is under. It's the amount of energy we have to produce. It's the amount of mechanical and metabolic load we put ourselves under. It is the training stress. And again, volume and intensity are the two biggest things here that dictate that. Now, on the other side, again, we have to recover, right? That's where the process actually turns your training into your fitness. This is where sleep, nutrition, mental stress, and overall activity come into play. And we'll talk about this a bit more on the section we get into recovering. But this process, again, has different levels. So you can have higher levels of recovery based on those things, depending on all those variables. So your sleep, your nutrition, your diet, your mental stress, all those things can either drive recovery up or they can slow your recovery down. So those are the primary variables that drive that recovery process. So if we look at metamorphosis and we look at what are the key things that I put in here to manipulate and change over time to progress, it's basically these 5 big variables of fitness, right? So the first one, training intensity. Again, training intensity is a big piece of what drives the amount of stress your body's under. If it's a very low intensity, that's a much lower level of stress than things that happen at higher intensities because the body requires less energy to do it and it's less challenging to homeostasis. The second thing is the volume, all right? So combined, the training intensity and the training volume are what make up the totality of the stress for a given workout. And then it's the training frequency, how often you train in a given week, that dictates the overall training load across, again, that entire training week. Now, above this is where we get into methods, and methods in the Metamorphosis program are just ways of training. So it's an organized way to cause specific sensors in the body to be set off, to cause the physiological changes that we're trying to stimulate as a result of training. So these methods, again, were just built from my years of experience based on research and practical, just experience and results. The methods are designed to cause those specific changes to happen that we want to see change in order to improve your conditioning. And then last, but definitely not least, would be the methods and exercises. Now, I put this on top because, again, a lot of times people think about programs as just a series of exercises, but they're not, okay? Methods are what drive the process of how the body is being challenged. The volume, intensity, and frequency are what determines how much. And the methods and the exercise and movements dictate where within the body, which muscle groups, which movement patterns get stressed. So all of these variables matter, but it's the base of the pyramid that's going to drive that stress recovery process. It's the top of that pyramid that's going to translate how that basically impacts your ultimate performance specifically. So the exercises you choose obviously dictates where you see improvements and which movement patterns either get better or more efficient or whatever the case may be. But we have to understand the big picture of each one of the steps in this process and how these 5 key variables are dictating and playing a role in how your body, again, turns the training you do into the fitness and conditioning that you see over time. So the biggest thing here to wrap things up is just understanding that when we look at the big picture here, fitness is a process. It's not a single event, it's a process. So it's a form of repetitive stress, and that repetitive stress causes the body to adapt in ways that lead to better fitness. And if we do our jobs right, if we follow the program effectively, we do the things we need to do for recovery, then our fitness improves, our conditioning gets better, and everything is great. But fitness does not happen when you're working out. It happens when you are recovering. So remember, there's two steps of that process of fitness. It's the training side and it's the recovery side. It's where the recovery side is happening that your fitness is actually improving. So exactly how that comes together, again, that is the result of these 5 key fitness variables that drive this. So when we talk about metamorphosis, again, the programming is built on these 5 variables. And coming up in the next section, we're going to be diving more into the recovery side because, again, metamorphosis is not just the training, it's also the recovery piece. So the next module, we'll dig into the recovery piece, talk about all the components that drive recovery now that we've finished up the conditioning. And then last but not least, we'll give you a program breakdown and go through how exactly I put together these 5 key variables in metamorphosis and what makes them so effective. So that wraps up this module on conditioning. Next up, like I said, is recovering to win.